There is a moment, quiet and precise, in the cold gray light before dawn when Venice looks less like a city and more like an argument between stone and water. The tide is rising. The green-black surface of the lagoon inches up the steps of 10,000 doorways, and the city, without complaint, makes room for it. This has always been the arrangement here. By the early decades of the 18th century, Venice held roughly 140,000 souls within its improbable borders, packed onto 118 islands separated by 177 canals and connected by over 400 bridges. By continental standards, this placed it among Europe's larger cities, larger than Rome at the time, yet possessed of something neither London nor Paris could claim: a density of spectacle, an intensity of layered experience that made visitors feel they had arrived somewhere entirely outside the ordinary logic of the world. The theater, though, was no longer quite at the height of its power. The Serenissima, the most serene republic, had dominated Mediterranean trade for 4 centuries, growing rich on spices from the east, silk from Persia, glass from its own furnaces on Murano. By the 1700s, the great trade routes had shifted. The Portuguese had long since discovered the sea road around Africa to India, and Dutch and English ships now cut through waters Venice had once considered its own. The Republic's merchant fleet had shrunk, its territorial ambitions contracted. Yet Venice remained wealthy, enormously, defiantly, almost stubbornly wealthy. And it spent that wealth in one of the most extravagant ways any civilization had managed: on beauty, on ceremony, and on pleasure. In the 1700s, the Carnival of Venice was no longer a festival. It was a way of life. To understand Venice in the 18th century, you have to resist the temptation to think of it as a city of streets. It was a city of flows. People moved through colli, narrow walking lanes rarely wider than 3 meters, and through campi, the open squares that served as neighborhood lungs. But the true circulation was on water. The Grand Canal snaked through the city in a reversed S, nearly 4 kilometers long, from 40 to 90 meters wide. Palaces jostling along each bank in an unbroken wall of marble, brick, and Istrian stone. Smaller canals, rio, threaded between buildings, carrying the daily freight of a living city. Wine barrels, firewood, fish, produce, furniture. Gondolas were the default transport. By mid-century, an estimated 10,000 moved on Venetian waters, a number that makes the modern imagination struggle to reconstruct the sheer noise and density. They were painted black by civic decree to prevent excessive displays of private wealth on public waterways. Gondoliers shouted at canal intersections, "Oi!" a warning that echoed off stone and water simultaneously, giving the sound a peculiar doubling quality. If you walk the narrow lanes of Venice today and hear that same cry, you are hearing something unchanged across 3 centuries. The street-level commerce operated in a constant low-grade hum. Vendors selling hot food from boats, lace makers sitting at doorways in Castello, water carriers hauling fresh water from the city's stone cisterns in the Campi. Autumn brought the acqua alta, when the tide pushed through the drains of Piazza San Marco before anyone was quite ready, and the city's lowest neighborhoods filled quietly to ankle or knee depth, while residents moved about on wooden platforms as though the flooding were a minor inconvenience, which, for most of them, it was. And winter brought the carnival. When Giovanni Antonio Canal, known to history as Canaletto, settled at the edge of Piazza San Marco with his camera obscura in the 1720s and 1730s, he was attempting to capture something genuinely difficult to hold in a single image. A space that changed entirely depending on the hour, the season, the tide, and who was in it. When we navigate through the paintings he left, adjusting the angle, pushing deeper into the crowd, following figures that the composition usually leaves at the periphery, we begin to sense the space as it functioned rather than simply as it appeared. The piazza was roughly 175 meters long and 57 meters wide at its eastern end, paved with light gray trachyte stone in a herringbone pattern that caught the water during acqua alta and reflected lamplight at night in a way that made the whole square appear to float. Two towers framed the western entrance, the Campanile and the Torre del Orologio, and the Byzantine domes of the Basilica of San Marco rose at the far end like something dreamed and then built. During Carnival, the piazza became something that defied the word festival. From October through Christmas, then again from Epiphany through the end of February, and informally at the election of every new doge, at state receptions, at religious holidays, the square filled with masked figures who moved through it in a kind of permanent theatrical production without a script. Foreign visitors reported that the carnival seemed to have no beginning or end, only variations in intensity. A Frenchman writing in the 1730s described arriving in Venice in November and not removing his mask for 3 consecutive weeks. The social logic of the mask was its most radical feature. Under Venetian law during Carnival, anyone wearing the traditional bauta, the white lacquered mask, the black tricorn hat, the black cloak, was legally ungenderless and unclassed. A senator stood beside a fishmonger and was, for all official purposes, indistinguishable. A woman could move through the city unescorted and unremarked. A debtor avoided his creditors. The mask was not merely a costume, it was a legal instrument that temporarily dissolved the Republic's rigid social architecture. And the Republic permitted this because the energy released through the carnival was energy not directed at the government. The piazza was also the location of Venice's most solemn ceremonies, and these coexisted with festivity in a way that reveals something essential about the Venetian character. State executions were carried out between the 2 columns on the piazzetta, those bearing St. Mark's lion and St. Theodore's figure, in the same open air where carnival tightrope walkers performed the volo dell'angelo, the flight of the angel, a tradition begun in 1558 when a Turkish acrobat descended from the campanile on a rope to lay flowers at the Doge's feet. Both acts were public. Both were theatrical. The difference was one of emphasis. The Palazzo Ducale occupied the southeastern corner of the piazza, directly facing the lagoon, and had occupied this site in some form for nearly 1,000 years. The building in 1700 presented to the water a facade of astonishing lightness. Colonnade upon colonnade, white Istrian stone over pink Verona marble, the whole vast structure appearing to balance on a grid of delicate arches that should not, by any reasonable engineering logic, have supported it. The effect was intentional. Visible confidence in impossible structures was itself a form of political communication. Inside, the Hall of the Great Council ran 53 meters in length, capable of holding the full voting membership of the city's patrician class. By the 18th century, around 1,500 eligible men from roughly 200 noble families enrolled in the Golden Book. When the council assembled beneath Tintoretto's Paradise, at 22 by 9 meters, one of the largest oil paintings in existence, the effect was of a government conducting its business inside a vision of eternal order. The Council of Ten operated in adjacent chambers of dark wood and elaborate ceiling paintings. Venice's internal security apparatus, responsible for state crimes and political intelligence, received denunciations through stone mouths, bocce di leone, set into walls around the city. The accused were brought through the palace's corridors to interrogation, and then across the Bridge of Sighs. Built in 1600 by Antonio Contin, nephew of the Rialto Bridge's designer, in Baroque Istrian stone, barely 11 meters long, the Bridge of Sighs connected the palace's interrogation rooms to the new prison across the narrow Rio di Palazzo. Its two barred windows looked out over the water toward the lagoon. Prisoners crossing it could see, through the stone grills, the open sky. In the 1700s, this bridge was not yet a tourist landmark. It was simply part of the functional route through the justice system of a functioning state. In 1755 and 1756, the palace's lead-roof prison, the Piombi, suffocating in summer and bitter in winter, held Giacomo Casanova, arrested on charges of practicing magic and spreading libertine ideas. He escaped in October 1756, climbing through the roof and entering the palace itself before walking out through a door servants had left unlocked, slipping away by gondola into the Venetian night. Whatever one makes of Casanova as a man, the escape is a perfectly Venetian story. The system penetrated not through force, but through improvisation, opportunity, and the willingness of the city's social architecture to let the right person through the right door at the right moment. The Rialto Bridge was, in the 18th century, approximately 150 years old in its current stone form. Completed in 1591 by Antonio da Ponte, after decades of debate about whether a single arch structure could span the Grand Canal without support columns. The canal at that point was nearly 50 meters wide. The bridge's single arch rose nearly 8 meters above the water. It had not fallen. By 1700, it was encrusted with 36 shops, goldsmith workshops, silk merchants, linen sellers, packed into 2 rows along the central passage, the rents from which flowed directly to the state treasury for maintenance. Below the bridge and extending north along the bank lay the Rialto Market, the commercial heart of a civilization that had been commercial since its beginning. The fish market, the pesceria, opened at dawn, the catch arriving directly by boat from fishing communities in the lagoon and the Adriatic. The vegetable market, the herbaria, sat adjacent. The entire infrastructure of daily trade was compressed into a dense pocket of streets and fondamente, where, from 5 in the morning until the bells of the Marangona announced the end of the session, the city conducted its most essential business. Moving through the engravings of this area, following the crowd of fishmongers in oilskin aprons, patrician servants negotiating prices, foreign merchants consulting paper lists, you notice the specific density of bodies at peak hours. A senator still in his black council robes, pausing to examine the eels, beggars at predictable corners, children running between stalls. The Rialto was also Venice's financial district. The banks, the money changers, the brokers who arranged the credit instruments that made long-distance trade possible. This compression of food supply, commerce, and financial infrastructure within 5 minutes of each other was not incidental. It was a design feature of a republic that had always understood commerce as its essential function. In 1638, the Venetian government opened the world's first state-regulated gambling house, the Ridotto, on the ground floor of Palazzo Dandolo, near San Moisè, a few minutes' walk from Piazza San Marco. The logic was characteristically Venetian. If gambling was going to happen regardless, it was better to happen in a controlled venue, with a portion of the proceeds flowing towards state coffers. The Ridotto was open every evening during Carnival. Admission required a mask and suitably respectable dress. The croupiers, called Barnabotti, recruited largely from the impoverished nobility of the San Barnaba district, were the only people in the room who showed their faces. When we move through period paintings of the Ridotto's interior, Pietro Longhi's intimate scenes of masked figures at card tables, we enter a world of almost theatrical silence. The rooms were low-ceilinged, candlelit, rich with the smell of wax and powder. The games were basset, piquet, and most importantly, faro, a card game in which players wagered against the house with unnerving speed. Fortunes changed hands in a single evening. The masks meant that each loss or gain was visible only in the hands, the posture, the slight forward lean of a body that had just gambled everything on a wrong card. The Ridotto closed in 1774 by decree of the Maggior Consiglio on grounds that Venetian families of good standing were being ruined at its tables. Gambling did not stop. It moved into private palaces, into smaller rooms off the Carnival route, into the city's invisible social infrastructure. The decree achieved the closure of a building. It changed nothing about the habit. At the eastern edge of the city, enclosed by high, crenellated brick walls occupying roughly 15% of Venice's total landmass, stood the Arsenale, the naval shipyard that had once been the most productive industrial complex in the known world. At the peak of its efficiency in the early 16th century, it had employed up to 16,000 workers who could theoretically assemble, rig, and arm a fully fitted galley in a single day, using standardized parts on a production line basis not seen again until the Industrial Revolution. In the 1700s, the arsenal was still functioning, but at a different scale. The core workforce of skilled arsenalotti, carpenters, caulkers, rope makers, sailmakers, numbered around 2,000 by mid-century, a fraction of the peak employment. The great sheds that housed ships under construction were still in use, but the urgency had drained from them. Venice was no longer building fleets for major naval campaigns. The Battle of Lepanto was a century and a half in the past. The arsenalotti were, despite this, among the most privileged workers in Venice. They had served as the Doge's honor guard since medieval times, received guaranteed wages, free medical treatment in the arsenal's own facilities. They worked up to 11 hours a day in summer and 6 in winter, forming a distinct community in the Castello neighborhood just outside the arsenal's walls. Literate, organized, and respected enough that the Republic felt obliged to manage their concerns carefully. In the Cannaregio district, about 20 minutes walk from Piazza San Marco, a small island had been, since 1516, the enclosed neighborhood where Venice's Jewish population was required to live. The word ghetto, now one of the most freighted words in European history, derives from ghetto, the Venetian word for foundry. Iron foundries had operated on this island before the community was confined here. Because expansion outward was impossible, the buildings grew upward, some reaching 7 or 8 stories, unusually tall for their era, their thin walls slightly bowing under accumulated weight. The streets within were even narrower than those outside, and the campo at the center, the Campo del Ghetto Nuovo, served as the community's outdoor common space and meeting place. The ghetto was locked at night. Jewish merchants and physicians could circulate through Venice during daylight, wearing the prescribed yellow or red hat that identified their status. At night, they returned. The arrangement was restrictive, yet by the standards of 18th century European Jewish life, the Venetian situation offered something the communities of many other cities did not: freedom from expulsion. The Republic found the community economically useful, the money-lending operations essential to Venice's credit networks, and this utility provided a degree of protection that pure tolerance could never have guaranteed. Commerce, in Venice, was always the most reliable form of argument. By the 1790s, equality was entering the Carnival festivities that contemporaries struggled to name. The pleasure was still real, the masks were still worn. But Venice, in its final decades, had the character of a city that knows, at some level, it is performing rather than simply living. The Carnival had become Europe's most famous tourist attraction, a required stop on the grand tour that brought young English, French, German, and Russian aristocrats through the continent, and the Republic accommodated them expertly, because tourism was another form of commerce. Then, in the spring of 1797, a 26-year-old French general named Napoleon Bonaparte drove his army through the Venetian mainland territories, making increasingly aggressive demands the Republic had no military means to resist. On May 12, 1797, the Great Council of Venice met for the last time. With French troops poised outside the lagoon, the council voted 512 to 20 to dissolve the Republic. After over 1,000 years of continuous existence, the Serenissima simply stopped. The last doge, Ludovico Manin, reportedly wept as he removed his ducal cap and handed it to an attendant. "Take it," he is said to have told him. "I won't be needing this again." Walking through Venice today, you are in direct physical contact with a remarkably large percentage of the 18th century city. The Piazza San Marco is still there, still floods in November, still sounds of bells every hour. The Basilica still holds its gold mosaics. The Doge's palace still stands on its Gothic colonnade. The Rialto Bridge still carries pedestrians across the Grand Canal. The Arsenal's walls are intact, its antique gateway lions, taken from Piraeus in Greece in the 17th century, still standing guard. What is gone is harder to see because it was never primarily architectural. The Republic itself is gone. The Great Council, the Council of Ten, the Doge, the Bocche di Leone, the whole intricate machinery of 1,000 years of self-government. The working population that maintained Venice as a functioning industrial city, the Arsenalotti, the fishermen of Castello, the artisans of Cannaregio, has largely dispersed or been replaced by a service economy oriented almost entirely around visitors. The ghetto is still there, still holds services in its upper floor synagogues, but its community is a fraction of its former size. The Carnival was revived in 1979 after nearly 2 centuries of absence, and it happens again every winter. Masks, costumes, Piazza San Marco filling with figures in Baroque dress against the Byzantine domes. It is beautiful, self-consciously historical, and genuinely festive. It is not quite the same thing as the Carnival of the 1700s, which was not a reconstruction of a tradition, but the living tradition itself, inseparable from the political organism that had created it. I have spent considerable time inside the paintings of Canaletto and Francesco Guardi, moving into their layered perspectives, adjusting the viewpoint, following figures just outside the frame, turning down the Rio that the composition never shows. This kind of meticulous visual reconstruction gives you something extraordinary, a way of being present in a space otherwise accessible only through description. You can follow a gondola around a corner and find yourself in a canal that no painter depicted. But it is not the same as being there. What I want, in the end, is simpler than any reconstruction. To stand in the Piazza San Marco in early February, with the acqua alta still drying on the stones, and hear the bells at noon in the cold Adriatic light. To walk the calle behind the Frari at dawn, when the city belongs briefly to itself and not to its visitors. To cross the Rialto Bridge before the market closes and smell the last of the fish and the cold water. The 18th century city is, in every important sense, gone. What we can recover of it, through images, through documents, through the buildings and canals that have survived, is genuine, precious, and irreplaceable. But it is a window, not a door. History allows us to look. The city that was is not the city we can enter. And that understanding, the respect for that distance, may be the only truly honest relationship we can have with the past. Venice is still there. The water is still rising. Go while you can.